welcome. It's very nice. We have so many friends and admirers of Ambassador Gregg here, and it's wonderful to have him back here at the Korea Society. He laid such a rich foundation from 1993 to 2009 here for the Korea Society as it is today, and he has an entire chapter in the book on it, which is wonderful. Having Don back is extremely terrific because his lifetime, as depicted in this book, is a fascinating one. And he has served the nation 31 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, 10 years with the White House, culminating in his position as National Security Advisor for then Vice President George H.W. Bush. And then going on to Seoul, where I know many people in this room met with Don and with Meg at Habib House as they served as ambassador and first lady for us in Seoul. I actually at that time was finishing a PhD, and I must say that dinner there with John Curtis Perry and the Fletcher Group, hosted by Ambassador and Mrs. Gregg, was a great encouragement forward on that. And I know he's inspired many people over the years. I next ran into Ambassador Gregg when I was at the Washington office of the Korea Society. I was with something called the Nautilus Institute, and the Korea Society at the time had a very dynamic program around that first nuclear crisis and really made a name for itself in Washington at the time. Don will work with us through the book, and we'll take some questions here for our audience, but I would like to just say that one anecdote that he shares that we hope maybe he can expand a little bit more on and tell us a little bit more about his society years is that of finding a society that had $200,000 in the coffers, much of which may have been spent hosting him for the welcome lunch at the Jockey Club. And he certainly laid a great foundation growing this organization to a $4 million plus annual nonpartisan nonprofit organization really dedicated to helping Americans understand Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to welcome to the podium Ambassador Donald Gregg, author of Pot Shards.
Thank you, Steve, and you've fixed me up with an ideal seating arrangement here so that I can stand or squat as my knees demand. Well, this is a great occasion. New friends, old friends, friends from Japan, friends from Korea, and I'm very happy to be back and to be able to talk a bit about Pot Shards. If people say, what have you been doing since you left the Korea Society, the main answer is writing the book. It took about 4 years. I had to have it cleared by CIA, which was a difficult issue. In my first draft, they said, we don't want any mention of the fact that you were in Japan. And I was there for 10 years. Our 2 daughters were born there. I think everybody in the world knows that I was in Japan. And what was the problem? And it's something that the agency euphemistically refers to as liaison equities. And we worked very closely with the Japanese National Police, which is a very good organization that handles intelligence, but the Japanese just don't like to have any mention made of that. And so if you read the book, you'll see that there is practically no mention of where I worked or for whom I worked. And one book reviewer up in Vermont said, you know, it's very interesting. He sounds as though he did nothing but sort of ski and play tennis in Tokyo. But anyway, that was one way to get the book out. I'm very glad I did it. It has brought a lot of very wonderful comments from people, and it shines a wonderful light on what a role Meg has played in my life, and her support through thick and thin has just been the main issue. And without her, I think none of these really good things would have happened. I've thought about what I'd like to say about the book, and a couple of things have come to mind, sort of three bests and three worsts. The three bests are the three Asians that I have met since 1952 that stand out most in my mind. And they are Deng Xiaoping, whom I met in 1982 with Bush, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, whom I've met numerous times, and Kim Dae-jung of South Korea. And I choose them because each of them, in the role they played as leaders of their countries, just absolutely transformed their countries. I was with Bush when he met Deng, and it was April or May 1982. It was a very, very key meeting where we were trying to get the Chinese to accept the Taiwan Relations Act and the fact that we were selling arms to Taiwan. The Chinese didn't like that at all, and Bush really demonstrated what a great diplomat he was in making the case to the Chinese that we were being true to friends, that this was not a violation of the Shanghai Agreement, and he succeeded in doing it. Deng was very small, very short, an excellent bridge player, terrific personality, and just made an instant impression on me. On that same trip, we met Lee Kuan Yew for the first time, and I remember him saying, Mr. Bush, we're fine about you being the sheriff of the Pacific, but make sure that your posse is Japanese, not Chinese, which I thought was a very interesting statement for him to make in 1982. He is an ethnic Chinese, but I think he knew what he was talking about, and he transformed Singapore after Malaya kicked him out. And Singapore is a remarkably successful country. Kim Dae-jung, no surprise, I think that I would select him since my beginning relationship with him was so dangerous or interesting or vital. There's a picture in the book which I just luckily found. It was the first time I actually met him. It was in New York. It was in Washington at the head of the Kyodo News Agency. And he was telling me the terrifying experience he had been through in 1973 when he had been kidnapped, was chained hand and foot on a boat in the Straits of Tsushima, beaten, spat upon, expecting to be thrown into the sea. And it was a very vivid conversation with him. And we went on to become very good friends. And when he became president, he invited me to his inauguration, and he said, you've done a lot at the Korea Society to improve relations between South Korea and the United States, but you haven't done much of anything with North Korea. I really wish you would plant the Korea Society flag in North Korea. And so that really lay behind my efforts to improve relations with North Korea, starting with my first trip there in April of 2002. And the last time I saw him, he had me to dinner, and it was just the two of us for dinner. And we talked about his hopes for North Korea. And he said, I think the best possible answer to the bedeviling problems of division is probably a 20 to 30 year process of the gradual opening up of North Korea, the improving of their economy, and the slow sort of process of reconciliation. And I was very interested. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in England, given by the University of Central Lancashire. A woman named Hazel Smith, who's lived in North Korea, put the conference on. It was the best conference I've ever been to on North and South Korea. Russians, Chinese, Europeans, Germans, South Koreans, Americans were there. And they brought the minister from the embassy, Korean embassy in London there, and he, at the end of his talk, gave his hopes for the future, and they were almost an exact replica of what Kim Dae-jung had said to me, and I was really very glad to hear that. And he said that he thought there might be a chance for a change of some of the hardline policies that South Korea has adopted under Park Geun-hye toward the north. So those are my three best. The three worst, anybody want to have a guess? No, I'd be interested. Now, who would, yeah, you all know me pretty well. Who would some of you choose to be my three? Fred? No, not W.
No, not really.
Not W. Close, but no cigar. Anybody else? Oh, come on. Yes.
Nixon.
No,
No?
not Nixon. No. Yes. No. All right. Well, they're all interesting choices. They are James Jesus Angleton, Curtis LeMay, and Dick Cheney. And all immensely destructive, dangerous men. First about Angleton. He had gained his fame by establishing liaison with Israel, which was an important thing to do. But he was absolutely paranoid about the Soviet Union, and he felt that it was impossible for us to recruit Soviets as agents on an ideological basis. And he thought the only way to get them to cooperate with us was through coercion. And it was utter bullshit. And it paralyzed our relations with the Soviet Union for years until Bill Colby finally fired him. I was in Burma for 2 years, and I had a very interesting relationship going with a young Soviet who wanted to be recruited and would have had some very interesting things to tell us. And I got an ice-cold message from Angleton saying, "You don't know what you're doing. He's clearly in charge of the relationship. You will not see him again." It's interesting, that brings up another thing that's not in the book, just briefly mentioned. There's a name, Polyakov, who was a GRU general, who had volunteered himself to the agency here in the United States and was turned away because of Angleton. He then went to the FBI, who checked him out and found he was a source of immense value and used him. And he then was transferred from New York to Rangoon. And the FBI had no people there. And so after a great deal of pulling and tugging, Angleton agreed reluctantly that we would handle him. And he was a magnificent man who accepted nothing in the way of pay. And he said, "The reason I'm cooperating with you is to make sure that the USSR doesn't win the Cold War, because that's not Russia. That's not what Russia is about." And so we used him. And when I went to Vietnam and thought of what might happen to me, the last thing I would have given up under interrogation was the name Polyakov. But what actually happened was that after Angleton was fired, the whole concept of counterintelligence was so bankrupt in the agency that the spy who torpedoed so many of our relationships betrayed Polyakov, who had retired, and he was taken out in front of his dacha and shot summarily. So that's why I chose Angleton. Curtis LeMay was a terrifying presence. I ran into him at a war game, which is discussed in the book. And he said there are no innocent civilians. And he was behind the firebombing of Tokyo. And in the war game that I saw him in 1974, we were discussing the beginning of bombing of Vietnam, North Vietnam. And he was all for it. And he explained his reasons for being for it. He said, when we start bombing them, they will want to bomb us. They don't have an air force, so they will turn to the Chinese as the North Koreans turn to the Soviets. And the Chinese will start bombing us. We will, of course, detect it, and that will give us an excuse to start bombing their nascent nuclear capacity in China. That was his scenario. And fortunately, the war game did not turn out, and he was absolutely enraged at the end of the game when the chairman of the red team, the Chinese team, had not reacted as he had thought they would. And it was Buzz Wheeler, who was the chief of staff of the Army, and LeMay leaned forward and just shouted at him and said, Buzz, you know goddamn well if I bomb your country, you're going to bomb mine. And LeMay said, Kurtz, that's the last thing in the world I would do, because I know what you would want to do in retaliation. And then LeMay said, which he said many times, oh, we can bomb those SOBs back into the Stone Age in 24 hours. And I guess it was McGeorge Bundy was there, and he said, well, maybe our problem is that they're so close to the Stone Age as it is. So I end my little reference to Curtis LeMay by saying we're lucky to have survived him. Then I come to Dick Cheney. And I guess I have to say I've sort of had encounters with him, which he was Secretary of Defense when I was ambassador, and he came to Korea at least once, and he seemed sensible, serious, but sensible. But he undid everything that I had accomplished at the end of my tour. How did that happen? Well, the first thing I did when I got to Korea was to call in the commandant of USFK and said, we've got nuclear weapons in this country. Why do we have them? And he said, oh, we've always had them. Incidentally, the Obama NSC asked that this be taken out, so this is not in the book. So I said, well, General, you know, we've got the Honest John rocket here, which it's a surface-to-surface missile with a 15-mile range that fires a nuclear warhead. How do you like that? 15 miles firing a nuclear warhead? And I said, well, General, would you plan to use these if there was a fighting? And he said, well, certainly not, unless I was ordered to. And so I then went to Blue House. General No Tae-yu was there, a very pragmatic general with a wonderful national security advisor, American-educated man named Kim Chung-wee, who had adopted a policy of complete transparency with me. And I explained to him why I was concerned about nuclear weapons. I said, we're going to start asking the North Koreans not to build them. And the first thing they will say to us is, well, why do you ask us to not build them when you've got them in the South? And No Tae-yu said, well, you've got a point. And so after careful three-way consultations, after I'd been there a year, I was able to send a message to the White House saying, with the full support of No Tae-yu and the support of USFK, we recommend that our nuclear weapons be removed. And I got a very short message back saying, you have no idea how helpful that is. And a year later, George Herbert Walker Bush, who I think is a wonderful president, vastly underrated, as is No Tae-yu, removed our tactical nuclear weapons globally. And that and the canceling of Team Spirit, which was an annual exercise that the North Koreans hated, which was sort of a reenactment of our intervention in 1950. We got that canceled in 1992, and that triggered 6 prime ministerial meetings between North and South, and the signing of 2 agreements between North and South, which still are among the high points of the North-South relationship. And then suddenly, as I was about to leave, I was told that Team Spirit had been reinstated for 1993, with Cheney leading the charge. The embassy had not been consulted. It undid everything we had done. North Korea pulled out of the NPT, and a major crisis in 1994 was only averted by Jimmy Carter going and talking to Kim Il-sung, rather. So that was sort of my first encounter with Cheney, and he's done nothing to endear himself to me from then on. So those are my bad three. I want to tell a funny story about the Korea Society. We got involved in a wide variety of things, and sometimes we did something only once. And the thing we did only once was to put on a concert at Avery Fisher Hall, and which seats about 1,200 people. And one of the members of our board, I don't see him here today, so I feel free to, anyway, he shall be nameless, came and said, I've got a friend who's got a wonderful daughter who plays the violin magnificently, and he's a great conductor, and let's put on a concert with him playing and his daughter also. And so I foolishly said, okay. And by so doing it, I outraged any number of Korean parents who had sons or daughters whom they felt were equally talented. An ugly scene developed. And also we found that the interest on the part of customers at Avery Fisher Hall was practically zero. And so we realized that we were going to have to get a well-known musician to sort of pad it. So we got hold of Earl Wild, who was then about 80, and a specialist in Rachmaninoff. And so we had the tentative program of the local symphony conducted by the local Korean, playing a couple of things, and then Earl Wild playing Rachmaninoff's third, and then something at the end. And so there was a dress rehearsal. And Earl Wild heard 10 minutes of the Korean conducting the symphony orchestra and got up and said, I won't play with this clown. So absolute refusal. And so that came to Fred's and my position. I should say, by the way, I'm so glad Fred Carrier is here, because the best thing I ever did in running this place was hire him. And he and I went through all kinds of Sturm and Drang, including this. So what to do? So we went to Earl Wild and said, well, do you have a suggestion as to who we could get to conduct? And he said, yeah, there's a guy named Schimmerhorn. He's the head of the Nashville Symphony Orchestra. And so I sent a message to Schimmerhorn telling him what had happened. And he was a terrific guy, and he laughingly said, yeah, I'll be glad to come. And so we then told the conductor that he could conduct the introductory piece, but he couldn't conduct the Rachmaninoff, and there was a little Sturm and Drang there, but he had no choice. So we got through the opening piece, and then out came Earl Wild with Schimmerhorn, and started Rachmaninoff. And I sort of relaxed, and all was going well, where suddenly Wild pulled a blank. And Schimmerhorn was on him like a hawk on a hen and got him going again with, I would say, no more than a 3 or 4 second break, which is an eternity in something like that. But it went on. And if Schimmerhorn hadn't been there, the other conductor would have been going like this, and World would have been sitting like that. It would have been worldwide headlines. Sam Koo was there with his wife, who's a renowned member of the Chung Trio, and she said, I almost slid under my seat when I saw that happening. But anyway, we got away with it. We had a full house. We made some money, but never again. And I think that's probably the narrowest escape that we ever had, near disaster with the Korea Society. I learned a lot about the nonprofit world. I thought it was sort of filled with blue-haired ladies with deep pockets and hearts overflowing with warmth. And I had some fantastic strikeouts as I sought to raise funds for the Korea Society. I had 2 awful sessions with the Ford Foundation. Awful. And I made probably the best pitch I've ever made to anybody to David Rockefeller and got Le Grand Zero from that. So it wasn't all good, but Korea was developing so well that really that was what pulled the Korea Society along so wonderfully well. I made 50 trips to South Korea during the years that I was head of the Korea Society for a variety of purposes, usually fundraising, and then 6 trips to North Korea. And the first of those trips was in 2002, after George W. Bush made his ill-advised Axis of Evil speech, tying North Korea with Iran and Iraq, and that caused everything with North Korea to come to a screeching halt. And I decided to write a letter to Kim Jong-il saying we need to come and talk. And what a wild idea. And the only person I told about this was Fred. And he said, well, they know who you are. And they certainly do. I still have a leaflet that they dropped when I was ambassador, which I picked up in a golf course, and it shows me, and it's in the book, by the way. I mean, it shows me sitting regally in a chair with No Tae-yu whispering in my ear, and we're discussing how to murder Kim Young-sam, and who succeeded him as president. So I wrote the letter and took it in to Lee Gun, who was at the North Korean mission, and he gave me a very good Korean reaction. He said, you know, who do you think you are writing a letter like this to my chief? And I said, well, you know who I am. And I said, you know very well who I am. Well, he said, well, how dare you write that letter? And I said, well, I think, you know, we're discussing things that I feel your leader needs to know about. Well, how do you know what he needs to know about? And I said, well, I've talked to a Russian named Toloroya who rode on a train with him when he was going to go see the Russian Soviet leaders. And I've talked to Madeleine Albright, who's very funny about her meetings with him. She had about 11 hours with him after the North Koreans invited Clinton to go to North Korea. And I spoke with her at the University of Michigan, and she said, well, Kim Jong-il and I have quite a lot in common. We're both about the same height. We both wear high heels, and we both put mousse in our hair, and that sort of got a laugh. So I named several people that I talked to who had told me what they thought we ought to talk to the North Koreans about, and so he sent the letter. And 2 weeks later, I was invited. And so the question was now to tell the State Department. And I teach a course at Williams 4 weeks every year, and it's on the politics of intelligence. And I get to this point in this story, and then I sort of ask my students, why do you think I didn't tell the State Department before writing the letter? Any of you have any opinions on that? Absolutely. They would have told me not to write it. So I had no idea what the reaction would be when I told them, but they were very pleased. And they sent a Korean-speaking Foreign Service officer with me who made very good sense. And that first meeting went well. I suggested to them that they return the Pueblo, which they were about to do when we accused them of a second approach to nuclear weapons, and that took that off the table. But Fred and I went with Don Oberdorfer for a second meeting in 2002 and brought back a printed offer to start talking, which the North Koreans asked me to take to the White House, which I did. I was in and out of the White House in 20 minutes. I met Condi Rice's deputy, Steve, what's his name? Hadley. When I dislike people, I forget their names. Anyway, we'd had the message translated, and he looked at it and he said, "No, we won't talk to them. That would be rewarding bad behavior." And I was in and out in 20 minutes. Not a single question asked about who had given me the message, how it had come that I got it, and nothing. And that's actually been the subtotal of the reactions from both administrations, Bush and Obama, to my 6 trips to North Korea. 0. They just don't seem to be interested in people wanting to develop dialogue with North Korea. I think that's a terrible mistake, and I hope that Obama, who knows how he's going to react to what happened yesterday? Who knows? I don't know. But the Obama administration, and I'm used to be a Republican. I'm no longer a Republican. I left after the Axis of Evil speech. But the Obama administration is a pretty closed corporation to those who are the outside looking in. I sat next to a senior woman of the White House staff at a lunch given by Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, and I made as much impact on her as rain on the windshield. She didn't care who I was. She didn't care about anything I'd ever had to say, so forth. And I also spoke on Obama's behalf against some in favor of his administration to some Korean Americans. My opponent was Ed Cox, who was head of the Republican Party in New York. I think I did pretty well, but I never heard from Obama. So, I cannot claim to have had much influence on anybody's thinking about North Korea, but I remain undeterred in my belief that we need to talk to them. Let me tell you a little bit about. You wanted me to talk about half an hour? Okay. My last trip was in February this year, and it had 2 purposes. We were trying to talk to the North Koreans about what their economic plans are, and then I took with me a man named Pete McCloskey, who was a congressman of 15 years. He was known as the Beowulf of the 5th Marines. Paul Newman made a film about him called Leading from the Front, and said McCloskey had led more bayonet charges than anybody since the Civil War. And McCloskey has PTSD as a result of what he did to win his medals. And he and I got to know each other on a war crimes investigation 15 years ago, and he heard I was going, and he said, "I'd like to go with you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I'd like to meet somebody against whom I fought and try to make peace with him." So I said, "Let's see." So I told the North Koreans that this is what he had in mind, and they said, "Fine, bring him." So off we went. He's a remarkable man. He's a Don Quixote. He's enraged almost everybody at one time or another. He's very much inclined to, environmental issues. He speaks very honestly on all issues. It was very hard on the Israelis when they sank the USS Liberty and denied it. So he's an iconoclast, and off we went. 4 of us. Spencer Kim, McCloskey, Lynn Turk, who's a retired Foreign Service officer, and me. We are all tied into Pacific Century Institute, which is I'm chairman of that now. And McCloskey is really a free spirit. A couple of years ago, he wrote me and said, "My wife and I are going to see George and Barbara Bush in Houston, or we'd like to see them, and can you arrange that?" So I was in touch with Bush, so I was able to get that door open. And he then wrote me an email and said, "Had a great visit with George and Barbara." And he said, "I'm not quite sure what possessed me, but as we left, I pressed into his hand a magnetic button that you can put on your icebox. And I said, "Mr. President, I think you'll enjoy this." And Bush looked at it and threw his head back and laughed. And what it said was, "Jesus loves you. Everybody else thinks you're an asshole." And so that's the kind of guy that McCloskey is. Meg and I later learned, we were down in Washington for a dinner where Jim Baker spoke. And I told Baker this story because I knew he and Bush had great relationships. And Baker looked at me and he said, "Bush sent me that goddamn button." And I told McCloskey, and he was absolutely delighted. He said, "Boy, that's a very high batting average." So anyway, the North Koreans had searched out a retired lieutenant general who was acting as a docent at their newly built war museum. And he and McCloskey met, and the North Korean general was utterly bewildered as to what the hell was this. And I tried to explain, and I'm not sure I had much, but I said, "Pete, you need to go back and see him a second time," which he did. And he started by saying to the general, "How many times were you wounded?" He said, 3. He said, how old were you? 17. What was your weapon? A heavy machine gun. And then he volunteered, "My gun crew and I, we think we killed 400 of you." And Pete then said, "Well, I've only been wounded twice. I was a second lieutenant. He'd been a private first class." And it became clear that they had many things in common. They hadn't actually shot at each other, but they'd been in some of the same encounters. And so they embraced, and Pete saluted him, and it was an amazing occasion, which the LA Times wrote up, and that is in the book. And more importantly of all, Pete's nightmares, which he's had for 50 years, have ended. And so I see that as, in minuscule, what we need to do with the North Koreans, and that will inspire me to keep going on that subject. So I'm really happy to be back here on this occasion to see all of you and to express my support for the Korea Society and what it's done, and to think back to how far we have come since the day in 1993 that I first entered this space. Our total space was maybe 1/3 the size of this room. Isn't that about right, Fred? Less? 1/5. Okay. Tiny. It's a staff of 3. I remember one of the first programs we put on, and I sat there waiting for one person to come. I think 3 did. So, we've come a long way, as they say, and you have carried it on beautifully. I'm happy to be here. So thank you for your attentions, and if you have any questions on the book, please fire away. Thank you very much. Yes, Rod.
Rudd, could you take the microphone? There you go. You just identify yourself.
I've read the book. I got a copy from Amazon long before you showed up with these outside.
You speak right into it. I don't think people can hear these wonderful words.
Okay. I've read the book.
Good.
And I congratulate you. It's a great piece of journalism.
Thank you.
Beautifully written. My question relates to the latter part of the book, which you also just dealt with. What incentives do you see possible for the North Korean elite, military and civilian, Kim on down, to accept any suggestion that is now coming out of this Seoul about a confederation as a future step toward unification? Why is it in their interest? Why would they think it worthwhile for a moment to make a move that would open them up to appreciation of what's going on elsewhere in the world, particularly in South Korea, and to give up any of the dictatorial rights that the military authorities and the civilian elite have today?
I think that things are changing in the North. I think that's a very legitimate question. I mentioned the fact that I'd been to a conference in England a couple of weeks ago, and I came back from there with a realization that the EU sees North Korea in a far broader context than we do. There were a number of countries there represented who have embassies in Pyongyang. A number of people had been to Pyongyang. There were 2 Russians that had lived there and visit Pyongyang almost annually. And they see the progress that Pyongyang has made. There was a man there who was able to give statistics on the caloric intake of the North Koreans as it has improved over the last 15 years, the average height and weight as a result of improved diet. In our trip in February, it was very interesting. I had been there for 5 or 6 years. Pyongyang is now quite a beautiful city. People are going around better dressed. A lot of them have cell phones. There's an Egyptian company that has the cell phone contract for Pyongyang. Kathy Zellweger, a Swiss woman whom I admire immensely, has lived in North Korea. She's monitored aid coming from Switzerland, and she testifies that things are better not only in Pyongyang but around the country. And what I heard from their chief economic planners in February was interesting. They said, we're dividing the country into 13 sections based on natural resources, population, topography, etc. We want to make each area, if possible, attractive to foreign investment, but we don't know how to do it. And we need help. And will you help us? And so the first thing we did was using Jerry Cohen. He conducted a session in Hong Kong with 2 or 3 North Koreans, trying to introduce them to the concept of international law. Fred, did you talk to any of those guys who were at that Hong Kong session? Okay. Then later, we put on a program in Dalian, China, with 20 young scientists to try to improve their English and to try to improve their understanding of international scientific standards to which their knowledge would have to adhere. And Fred was there. He said it was really a life-changing experience for the North Koreans as well as the Syracuse instructors. They were together for 3 weeks. The North Koreans, Fred was there the whole time. Do you want to say anything about that program, Fred? We'll just say 50 words or less.
Well, it's part of what we call our U.S. DPRK Scientific Consortium, and it's something we do with the American Association for the Advancement of Science and an organization called CRDF in Arlington, and Syracuse and MPCI. And we've had a number of occasions like this training program. This is the 4th training program that we've done, and they're generally about 3 weeks long, and they generally involve about 20 North Koreans. And the idea, as you said, is really simply to begin a dialogue about how we can live together with mutual awareness and compliance with international standards.
Yeah. So to get back at long last to your question of confederation, I think that what Park Geun-hye has said about their coming together is sort of like hitting the jackpot, and that it might happen suddenly and that this would work to the benefit of people. And the North Koreans are very much opposed to that. And they are much more interested in the kind of gradual process that Kim Dae-jung outlined and that the South Korean minister outlined. So I think they would have very little interest and probably strong opposition to signing up anything with a particular name on it. I think what they want is economic assistance. They know that They have to disband. If there's going to be peace, they're going to have to disband their army and find something for their soldiers to do. And so I think they are interested in a gradual process, but I think they would be very opposed to confederation, because I think it's been proposed as sort of a shortcut to sort of everything ending happily with South Korea winning and North Korea losing. And they're not interested in anything like that. Good question. Yes. Yes.
Herbert Levin. I haven't read a book, and I wondered why you decided to write a book about marijuana, but I look forward to reading it. When you look at American efforts in foreign policy, whether it's détente with the Soviet Union or the opening with the Chinese, you had to have some members of Congress who were sympathetic. Ordinarily, you had the far right who said this is very bad, that those people are insane, you shouldn't dignify them. And you had people on the left saying they have a very bad human rights record and you should make them back down. The question is, who in the Congress, never mind the party, would say, yes, having an interchange with various aspects of North Korean society is a good idea? Who would welcome this in the Congress?
I think very, very few at this point. I think the process is a very difficult one. I took, and I think you were there, I took Jang Il-hun, the North Korean ambassador to the Council on Foreign Relations. And I have been assailed by the human rights people who said, what, why in the world do you bring, they're the worst kind of people. How dare you bring? All right. But you'd have, in Congress it might be worse. But I think there are sensible people in Congress. There have been a few who have gone there. And if their understanding is brought to them, I think there are an increasing number of people who would be interested in doing that. I suggested when Kim Jong-un first appeared, I suggested to Joe Biden that we invite him to the United States for an orientation tour, and that was turned down because, they said the Republicans would just think that was ridiculous. So it's a hell of a problem. When you demonize people, as we demonized Ho Chi Minh, as we demonized the North Korean leaders, it's very difficult to find anybody who is interested in anything but a continuation of the status quo. And by the way, in the title of the book, to which I'm very attached, I'm using it for my course at Williams, and I went to the bookstore to make sure that it was in, and the woman said, "Oh, is this a book about gardening?" The worst interpretation, even worse than yours, was somebody that thought I was writing about the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot. Anyway, so I think that the more astute of you would get the symbolism of the name, and the picture which Meg took really helps. But thank you. Yes.
Time for one last question.
In the front row. Yeah.
Ambassador, you're as sharp as a tack.
Who are you, please?
Oh, I'm with the Korea Society.
Oh, good.
I'm just enjoying the ride. But you have a fantastic memory as we speak. Have you always had a great memory, or do you keep copious notes that you assemble, you compose after, every so often in your career? Do you have a photographic memory? It seems to, you seem to have a vivid experience of the things that you talk about as you speak about them on the podium. So I suspect you really do have a fine memory. So
what a compliment. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
I mean, that's why I named the book Pot Shards. Because, and I ask in the beginning of the book, why do certain broken shards remain? Why do certain memories remain? And so I wrote about the memories that remain. I couldn't keep a diary when I was with CIA. That was ruled out. And what helped me a lot was that I wrote a lot of letters to my mother, who kept the letters. And so that was enabling to me to go back and read some of the things I'd said at the time. But I do have a good memory, and I've written about the things that I remember and the things that have real meaning to me. And so that's why I think the book as a whole has meaning to me. But thank you. That was a very nice compliment and a very nice note on which to end. Last questions are usually awful. I'll tell you a last question that really got me. I was talking to my high school, from which I graduated in 1945. The last question was from a student. Said, Mr. Gregg, when you graduated from high school, there was so much less history to talk about. What did you focus on? So thank you
That's a
very
great
much.
note to end. Thank you, Ambassador Donald Gregg.